Let's do it.
Hi there, I'm Janelle Benjamin, and welcome back to another episode of Twice as Hard. I am here with my guest, Elizabeth Leiba. She is founder of the Black History and Culture Academy and host of the Black Power Moves podcast. Welcome to the show, Liz. I'm really happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Liz, I wanted to bring my favorite LinkedIn personalities together, and certainly this show would be void without you. You are a top LinkedIn voice who always has lots and lots to say around issues of Blackness. And this is an issue personally for me that is really important. And I feel like there's a collective thread that kind of ties Black women together globally, no matter where we are in the diaspora, together around this issue of, this notion that we've had to work twice as hard. So talk to me about, first of all, whether or not that was a thing for you growing up and where that notion originated from in your life.
It's a really good question. For me, I think I always think in terms of the diaspora because I'm not from here. Like I was born in UK. My parents are Jamaican. They immigrated to UK, both of them as teenagers, and met there. My dad's family originated in Cuba, so Jamaica, Caribbean, Latin background, and then my mom's just straight Jamaican. And then I was pretty much born and raised in UK. I actually come to Florida until I was 12. So I always look at everything from the sense of an outsider. I was always told by my parents, you have to work twice as hard. That's literally one of the first things that I remember hearing, because they not only looked at things through the lens of being Black, but also through the lens of immigrants who didn't really understand American culture, did not know the ropes in terms of how to navigate school or financial aid or guidance counselors. I had a podcast myself a while ago, and I remember talking to somebody in DC in education, and he talked about how he worked in the Washington, DC public school system when he was a teacher before he got into government. He felt like, parents never showed up. He was always shocked by, in DC public schools, how a lot of parents wouldn't come up to come into the PTA meetings, or they weren't involved. And I got super triggered, and I was like, okay, maybe I need to calm down. But hey, my parents never came to PTA meetings. My parents were working 2 jobs. They worked minimum wage jobs, and they didn't have time for PTA meetings, because you work at 7-Eleven and you're a nurse and you're a CNA and you're trying to go to school to be a nurse, because your credentials, which you have many credentials, but they were from another country. And I think sometimes as an immigrant, you're coming to a totally different environment. Some immigrants don't speak English, and now you do have to work twice as hard, because now you have to overcome language barriers or cultural barriers or education barriers. You're highly educated in your country. I've seen so many people here from my own experience being in higher ed, where I was a doctor in my country. I was a lawyer. I was this, I was that. Okay, great, in your country, but here you have to start and get an associate degree. Right. So I think that sense of having to work twice as hard because of all that is something that I'm definitely very in tune to, because it's been my life. It's something that has always been. And we could probably talk about all the reasons why that happens, but I definitely feel like it's something that we need to look at to figure out why that's happening and how we can navigate that in meaningful and safe ways that are not harmful to us. So
yeah, I think for me, it's the notion of having to work twice as hard. Sometimes I wonder if that comes from within our culture, or is it something that's put upon us from the outside, right? Is it as a byproduct of racism that we have to rail against a system that makes us feel as if we have to work twice as hard? Is it a myth? Is it reality? Do we really have to work twice as hard? And in what ways is it helping or hurting us? And I guess, to be successful in anything that we do, we almost feel sometimes like it's been a great thing that we've achieved and worked twice as hard over our lifetime. But I want to talk about sometimes the ways in which that notion can hurt us. And can you speak maybe more about your career journey and the ways that has showed up for you?
Yeah, I think that for me, I'm always trying to deconstruct it. in the sense of, I know that it's something I grew up hearing and learning. Sometimes it's hard for us as Black folk to push back against some of the messages we heard growing up, because it's almost like, well, my parents told me I have to code switch, or my parents told me I have to, be excellent. Black excellence is something that people are pushing back against. It's like, well, why do we have to be excellent? Why can't we just be? But there's a sense of, you have to go to college, you have to work twice as hard, you have to show up on the job, and you can't be sad. You don't have time to let them see that you have an attitude. You have to make sure that you're showing up, showing out. And we see other people, we see Brad or we see Karen, and they're getting promotions and they seem mediocre. And we're like, well, I'm not mediocre. I'm like putting in hours. I think there was always a joke around the office in any workspace that I've worked in among Black folk, like, you can't leave early, you don't take a long lunch, you don't take breaks, you're at your desk, you go to your co-worker's cube, and you're like, okay, I can only talk to you like for 5 minutes because they're gonna think we're planning.
Yeah, we can't be seen together.
Can't be seen together. They thinking we're gonna plan a riot in here. So there's a lot of things that we do that are, I think, harmful for sure, because it gives us a sense, and like you, I always wonder, is this internal? I think a lot of it's messaging. A lot of it is the fact that we look at the environments around us and we know that there's usually only a few of us, and that statistics are proving that. It's not something that we're making up. We know that we're not represented in the C-suite. It's like 3%. I work in higher ed. There's 5% faculty, about 7% administration, which is definitely not representative of the demographics of the country. So we have to ask ourselves what is happening there, and a lot of that is systemic. It's generational. There is a dominant theme across the country now of, well, hey, just work and do what you need to do. And a lot of this is, the woke mob is saying that there's racism, and I don't have a racist bone in my body, and I don't see color. But we're not saying that you have a racist bone in your body. What we're saying is, systemically, there has historically been groups that have been excluded and marginalized, and the law has allowed that to happen. So how do we deconstruct that? And I think this idea that we hold ourselves to, I use a lot of this Black excellence hashtag and Black girl magic hashtag, but at the end of the day, is it fair for us to create this narrative where we have to work twice as hard as someone else that just comes in the office and they just are able to perform? And when they perform, they are rewarded. We I think sometimes do have to push back against that, because it's not, most of us, I think 97% of us don't want to go back in the office. Why is that? We're performing, we're doing our jobs, but we don't want to go back in the office because we're trying to live up to standards that were not made for us, and inherently are unhealthy. And I think that the twice as hard is one of those standards, for sure.
You're raising, for me, this concept of like the colonial forces that we had to deal with, right? And the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of slavery, and the fact that, yes, we are dispersed throughout the diaspora as Black people, as Black women in particular, and the ways in which our behavior, no matter where we are in the UK, in Canada, in the United States, wherever, we're operating similarly in workspaces, right? We're shoo-shooing behind the water cooler, and we don't want to be sitting together in the lunchroom. And that behavior, to me, is an exact fallout of, the legacy of slavery. The notion that, we had to work twice as hard, whether we were in the big house or we were in the field, we had to do the work, or that whip was cracked. And so I feel like we've internalized that and generationally passed it down, because a lot of the women that I'm speaking to through this series will share that their mothers has been the one that, including my own, to share that you have to work twice as hard. And that immigrant journey is my parents' story as well. And so it's like, the way that we have to show up in white spaces is also told to us, behave like this, act like this, sit like a lady, cross your legs like that, eat with this fork and not, put it in this hand and not that hand. I remember like being lefty, my parents trying to switch the way I would hold my pen or switch the way I would hold my fork, because they thought, decorum is going to be so important for me in the world and the way that I show up and present. God forbid somebody discovers that you're lefty, right? But you can't hide your Blackness. And so for me, it's really important to have this conversation for two reasons, right? We want to educate, of course, corporate leaders and create safe spaces for Black women in the workplace where we can just show up and be and exist and assemble and communicate and talk without fear of repercussions or consequences. But at the same time, I want to educate our Black people, right? Our Black women, that, you know, we need to, like you said, deconstruct and decolonize and do things differently, operate differently, and like you said, um, just show up in the world and just be. What do you say to that?
Last year, when George Floyd was murdered, I made a conscious effort because I went through trauma, right? And I think sometimes we don't acknowledge that, or we don't hold space for the fact that when we see Black bodies being brutalized, it's just like statistically, after the Civil War up until 1955, 56, when Emmett Till was killed, there were about 4,000 and some odd people, Black folk, white folk as well, but majority Black, who were lynched in the United States. So those bodies typically were taken pictures of, and not always lynched from a tree, sometimes dragged behind a car, sometimes stoned, sometimes burned like a bonfire. And pictures would be taken, and those pictures would be used as souvenirs. People would use them as postcards and mail them to friends and family. You know, hey, I was at this lynching, you want to check this out, kind of thing. Kind of like social media for us today. So today we don't have that,
Right.
obviously, but I think about Emmett Till and the fact that he was born like 6 months before my dad. My dad just had a birthday. So Emmett Till, if he would have lived, was born 6 months or so, 18 months, sorry, 18 months before my dad. So when we think about these murders and brutalization, lynchings, for example, that wasn't that long ago, because he would have been my dad's contemporary.
Right.
Now we have not lynchings, but we have Black bodies being brutalized, murdered, Ahmaud Arbery, Mike Brown, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. The list goes on and on. So that's traumatic for us because we know we're Black or brown. We know that, you know, we as Black folk, we're held to a different standard when it comes to interactions with the police, people that think that they're in authority. When people say, well, you know, police protect us. We understand that. We get the idea that there's police. We get to understand the fact that there's army. We understand the fact that there are certain structures that are in place for law and order, but all that comes from slavery as well, in terms of police. But when you have police that are clearly abusing their power, when we think about the fact that we have to navigate spaces and these are things that we could come into contact with, it is traumatic, right? So I avoided looking at the George Floyd video last year. I didn't want to see that because I felt as though it would affect me. And I am an empath, which is why I do what I do. I think I've always been someone that likes to help people. I'm a teacher, even though I went to school to be a journalist, which is people always say, oh, you're right, you're right. I didn't feel comfortable being a writer. You know, I went to University of Florida, predominantly white school, had internships at the local paper, had been a high school newspaper editor, and still felt like, you know, I'm not gonna be good enough.
Right.
You know, I am scared to go into a newsroom when everybody is telling me, all the Black reporters are telling me that it sucks being in the newsroom, being the only Black person or one of only three. Mm-hmm. And you don't get paid a lot. And why go to college and you could go work in other fields and not have half the stress of someone that's on the front lines reporting news of all these things that are stressful. So I chose a different route. But at the end of the day, I think that for me, when I looked at the murder, I felt like that's something that when I saw it in the news, that's something I don't want to see. And I remember my son, he was watching TV and it just happened to be on the TV, a little clip on the news. And I looked up and I was like transfixed. Mm-hmm. It was like watching a lynching, like a public lynching in front of our eyes. And I literally had panic attacks for the rest of the week. I couldn't function. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking. I was snapping at everybody because I'm like, I just watched a murder. Mm-hmm. And do people see this? And that's all people did rise up around the country. But it was literally at that moment in time that I said, you know, I'm not going to code switch. I'm not going to take the bass out of my voice. I'm not going to change the way that I speak, act, talk. A lot of people didn't even know I was tatted up. I have a ton of tats. I have people say, oh, you went and got you got piercings since the pandemic. No, I've been had these, but I just never wore them. So people didn't know. Right. Because I always felt like if people see that, That's not professional. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to. This is like this deconstructing working twice as hard. I'm not going to allow people to tell me that if I'm tatted, pierced, if I'm speaking a certain way, if I have big earrings, whatever it might be, that people have a misconception or a stereotype about what Black excellence, quote unquote, looks like. I'm not going to conform to that, because that's not fair. Because at the end of the day, a George Floyd can be killed the same way as a Breonna Taylor can be killed, who was an operator. She worked for the county. So does it matter? It doesn't really matter what you do, how you look, how you present. I had a false arrest. I wrote about it on LinkedIn. I was 19. I was a college student, and I was ashamed of that. A lot of people didn't know about it until I posted about it on LinkedIn. But it was at that time that this happened with George Floyd that I'm like, you know what? I'm going to deconstruct this idea that if you're doing the right thing and following the law, that you won't get arrested, because it happened to me. I had a false arrest and had to get the charges dropped by a lawyer, and then had to sue the people that arrested me. My lawyer said, you ain't gonna get rich, but we're gonna send a message to them.
Right.
And this was a middle-aged white man. What they did was wrong. They should not have called the police on you and accused you of stealing a $2 item. And now you have a record, and that's not fair. So I think when it comes to deconstructing Blackness and what Blackness is, and how we're supposed to present and what we need to do, I'm really passionate about that as something that has to be done. We don't have to conform, because I've worked in many fields, and a lot of times, like I worked in addiction treatment, and my managers were sleeved with tats. The people that own the facility have gauged out ears, and they're cursing and they're vaping. Whoever owns the structure sets the rules.
Yes.
And that's literally what's happened. Black folk have not been able to set the rules, because we typically, even if we're providing the content, look at hip hop, look at it, but we don't own anything, right? Even if we're providing the services or whatever's being shown, music, culture, we're known for having a very, and we typically are not the ones that are actually setting the precedent for what gets shown and how. I've had so many conversations with people where they're like, yeah, it's great that, we're able to express ourselves, but we're not at the table. And I think that's a part of why I'm like, well, you know what, if I'm not going to be at the table to make the decisions, I'm not going to allow people to tell me what I need to look like, because that's not fair. And we also need to navigate spaces where we create our own tables. My soror, a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, pull up a folding chair, which I agree with that to a certain extent. But I also believe that if the door is locked and barred, then I can't pull up a folding chair. So maybe we just need to create our own tables where we can be our authentic selves, and we don't have to worry about people telling us, well, that's not appropriate.
That's exactly what I had to do, through my company that I founded right after George Floyd was killed as well. All Things Equitable. Don't forget to hit like and share and subscribe to the All Things Equitable channel below. I had to do that, right? Precisely because of the experiences that I've had in workplaces. And I like what you're saying about, the ways in which we have been prevented from showing up in the world, right? People will take what happened with George Floyd and wonder, why did that become a global movement and move into the workplace, right? It could have stayed as a justice movement in the streets, in criminal justice arenas and in the law, but it moved into the workplace because we're tired. We're tired of, like you said, having to police ourselves and conform and move and operate differently and be held to different standards. I like that, you related to the standards that are sometimes, it's insurmountable and unattainable for us because of the color of our skin. We will never show up we will never, no matter how much we shuck and jive and, play the role, we will never be white. We will never be white, on site. And so we need to create spaces where we can be ourselves. We need to be able to exist in this world. And I don't code switch. I don't change the bass of my voice either. I've stopped doing that for a very long time. And I think that because I've always showed up as me, I've been rejected from the workplace, right? I've had to create my own table, seat, table, the whole shebang, the whole dining room, precisely because I'm me in these corporate spaces and it's not accepted, right? Eventually, I'm too bright, I'm too gifted, I'm too outspoken. I'm giving you the advice that you pay me for. I mean, I was a policy advisor, but take your own direction. But then it's she's too opinionated, she's too this, she's too, and eventually, there's the door, right? Or I'm right there and I'm marginalized and I'm oppressed right where I sit. And that's happening to so many people in the workplace who haven't created their own table at this time. The oppression is real, and the experiences of that knee on that neck, what George Floyd went through in the street, is what we're going through in the workplace. And I don't think these corporations really get that. They're running around, they're doing all these initiatives right now for diversity and inclusion, but I don't think they really get how it feels to have that knee on that neck. And George Floyd, we felt that, because we know that, we live that day in and day out. So thank you for drawing that attention to that, Liz. I want to just end by just congratulating you for all of your successes and the ways in which you've showed up in the world and transformed yourself after George Floyd, to be the top LinkedIn voice that you are, and just just a delight on the platform. You're sharing Black history, you're sharing Black power moves, you're doing the most, and you're working twice as hard, maybe 3 times as hard as anybody I can see on that platform. So why don't you share a little bit about your successes, the ways in which you're working twice as hard right now, and then tell people how they can reach you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think same thing. I just started out using LinkedIn as my diary. I didn't really set out to be an influencer on the platform. I set out to say, you know what, I'm triggered. Everybody gonna be triggered. So I'm about to just express myself. Like you said, the frustration of not even being able to go in the workplace and huddle with someone by the water cooler for 5 minutes. Now I'm just sitting in my house because we're all on lockdown. And how do I get these feelings out? How do I express how disappointed I am with this country and allowing this to happen? How do I express how I feel fear sometimes? If I get pulled over by the cops or I see lights in my rear view, my heart is racing on the way to work. So there's no way to turn that off. It's not like you said, it's become an overlap. It's because we're tired, and there is an overlap because if we're not George Floyd, we know someone like George Floyd, and we've seen that in our neighborhoods where we grew up or whatever the case may be. We're not all lying, because like you said, it's across the diaspora, UK, Canada, Africa, even. Some people are surprised in majority Black countries. My family's from Jamaica, and there's a lot of inequity there, even though it mostly manifested with classism. There's still so many issues that a lot of us have to navigate, and we all kind of come together around that. So as far as on LinkedIn, that's been my primary platform of just expressing that and being real about it, being authentic, being vulnerable about the struggle of the trauma of it, the mental aspects of a lot of it, and how I've navigated it. And that's where the top voices came from. I was a LinkedIn top voice at the end of October 2020. And then that was really what spurred me to do Black History Culture Academy, because I wanted to just create a platform for educating. So Black History Culture Academy is there. It's about 50 classes with micro learning courses, subscription style, on African American history, culture, African history and culture, and DEI, short courses that people can just, hey, I want to learn about microaggressions. What are microaggressions? I want to learn about the history of African American literature, as I don't know a lot about that. So people can do that in a little short burst, and in the afternoon learn about it. And that's mainly what I've done up until this point, until I had the opportunity to host the podcast on Ebony's brand new podcast network. Is called Ebony Covering Black America Podcast Network. So they launched a podcast. Soft launch of the podcast network was at the end of November last year. And I'm going into the second season now, where just highlight Black voices, highlight people that I've come into contact with across LinkedIn, social media, people that I know just from just personally interacting with them, that are just doing big things. So anybody that's in any area, whether it's in, I've had people in sports, I've had people that are in marketing, people that are in education, whatever, people that are in criminal justice field, and just come on and talk about things that you're doing. And I want us to have positive, influences, and I think it's all about Black representation as well. I've been more empowered on LinkedIn in the past year than I have been in my whole professional career. Because sometimes you're in predominantly white spaces and you tend to feel like, am I just like, is there just not a lot of Black people really doing stuff? Or you just want to connect with people that you can see as a role model, people that are really doing great things. It gets you inspired or gives you an idea maybe of things that you can do. So that's another opportunity, I think, for people to connect with me. People can connect with me on LinkedIn if people are interested in learning more about Black history, culture. I'm going to be rolling out courses for kids, because a lot of people are like, hey, I want to do this, but I want my kids to know about this stuff, like the CRT pushback and all the things that are going on in the news. I really feel like my children need to know a lot more about Black history. So that's another thing that's going to be rolling out for Black History Month for me this year. So a lot of big things going on. People can connect with me on LinkedIn, so they can kind of follow my content on there and just reach out to me and be a part of it. It's just a movement. I want to make sure that I'm always empowering Black folk, because that's really what I'm here for. I think that's what I was placed on this earth for, to empower other Black people.
Well,
that's what I plan to do.
You certainly empowered me, along with a lot of the other women that will be featured to this podcast, this video podcast. I really, really appreciate you coming on and being a guest. I am certainly a fan, a follower, a favorite of yours. And I can't say enough about Elizabeth Leiba. Please connect with her. Everybody that's watching, you will certainly learn about the culture, and not just the negatives, right? You're really shining a light on Black excellence, and the joy, right? The Black joy, the things in our community that really bring light to us no matter where we are. And I really appreciate you, and thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye, everyone.